Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to wait a minute. There are still people coming in. So thank you to those of you who have already signed in. We'll get started in a minute. Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you who have joined us. I'm Karen Remler, Professor Emerita of German and Jewish Studies at Mount Holyoke College, and I'm pleased to welcome you today to our discussion of the recent published book, Fascism in America, Past and Present, and I'm delighted that the two editors of the book, Gavriel D. Rosenfeld and Janet Ward, are with us today. Unfortunately, Ruth Ben-Giat wasn't able to join us, so it's just the two editors and myself discussing the book. Before we launch into the discussion, I just want to take a minute to thank a few people. Foremost, the director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies, Alain Confino. I would like to acknowledge to his credit his leadership and directorship of the Institute and the tradition of creating forums, open forums with speakers from around the world to address, as we know, crucial issues. I also wanted to thank Eric Ross, who is the administrative coordinator of the Institute, who is responsible for all the logistics and for getting you here and for keeping you here, and for putting out the word about this particular event. So thank you, Eric. A few words about format. I'm going to open the discussion with Gavriel and Janet on their book. Again, the book is a collective effort. There are 14 other contributors to the book as well, and I know some of you may be on this webinar, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A. The way the Q&A will work is anyone on this webinar may type in a question in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can do so at any time. And after about 30 or 40 minutes of discussion, we'll open it up and I will then read your questions so that Gavriel and Janet can respond to them. So thank you in advance for doing so. And I also ask for forgiveness. We have limited time. We're scheduled to end no later than 2:15. So I apologize if we're not able to get to all of your questions. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce the editors of this volume. I know it's hard to see, it's in the sun and it's backwards. It's a provocative cover, which we may talk about at some point, Fascism in America. Janet Ward is the Brammer Presidential Professor of History and a faculty fellow for strategic initiatives at the University of Oklahoma. She's been an American Council on Education Fellow with Yale University, where she's been working on global engagement and affiliated with the Yale's Office of International Affairs. She's an avid supporter of the humanities in multiple leadership roles and capacities, and a former president of the German Studies Association. She is the author of Post-Wall Berlin, Border, Space, and Identity, and Weimar Surfaces, Urban Visual Culture in 1920s Germany, and her forthcoming monograph, Sites of Historical Memory, will be published by Bloomsbury. Welcome, Janet. Gavriel D. Rosenfeld is president of the Center for Jewish History in New York City and professor of history at Fairfield University. He's the author of The Fourth Reich, The Specter of Nazism from World War II to the Present, Hi Hitler, How the Nazi Past is Being Normalized in Contemporary Culture, Building After Auschwitz, Jewish Architecture and Memory of the Holocaust, as well as multiple other publications. He edits the blog Counterfactual History Review and is an editor at the Journal of Holocaust Research. So I'd like to start with a few brief observations about the book, and then raise questions for both of you, Gavriel and Janet. First of all, congratulations on the book and its timely publication, unfortunate timely publication. I hope we have time also to talk a little bit about the cover that I showed recently. And I also wanted to commend you on pulling together a very impressive group of scholars and practitioners to contribute to the volume. The volume has 4 major categories: strategic thinking about fascism, homegrown Nazis, white anti-democratic violence and Black anti-fascist activism, and countering fascism in culture and policy. The volume not only addresses the continuities between past and present day far-right movements, fascist movements in the US, for example, it also considers the dire consequences of the political, social, and cultural divisions in the United States and the current unstable and violent global crisis. So your volume reminds us that we gain not only insight, but also tools for practical countermeasures by remaining vigilant to the ideological, political, and social threats of fascism that are not necessarily imported from Europe, for example, but have been part of the very fabric of the precarious and sometimes fragile American democracy. That is, you and others in the volume have pointed out that fascism in America is not an aberration, but rather part of an ongoing process, something that the contributors very succinctly and expertly demonstrate through the inclusion of a number of case studies that examine the influence of past groups, such as the Silver Shirts, the German American Bund, the America First and Christian Front components and movements, but also by examining the afterlives of American fascist movements and their influences on the current political spectrum, including, of course, forefronting the rise of Trump. I'm struck by the changing definitions, but also the not changing definitions of fascism in your volume, and the ways in which your contributors have revisioned and re-examined the different components of fascism, such as the incitement of violence, the mobilizing of emotions of hate, issues of hypermasculinity, the exclusion of the other, the corralling of the mob, idealized victimhood, and other core platforms based on racism, anti-Semitism, and the idealization of whiteness. Reading these essays convinced me that we are facing a more complex and perhaps even more deep iteration of fascism in the present day. And in fact, that these particular tendencies and ideologies have gained a legitimacy unseen before. So in reminding us that fascism is alive and all too well in the US, I'd like to pose a question or two to start our conversation and welcome your thoughts on a number of observations. The first is, given that there is a plethora of publications, of podcasts, of essays, of discussions on the subject of fascism that has been ongoing, but become obviously through the rise of Trump, and even before, I would say, also after 9/11, more prevalent, particularly in, for example, Roger Paxton's Anatomy of Fascism. I'm wondering sort of what were the decisions you made in putting together this volume, and what distinguishes this volume from other works, ranging from Rachel Maddow's prequel to Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny, Jason Stanley's How Fascism Works, Sarah Churchill's work on American fascism, and of course, Ruth's work on strongmen. So that would be my first question, the genesis of this work, what makes it distinction? And then, of course, the ultimate question, what is fascism today in America? Janet, I think you were going to start us off.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for this invitation today. What compelled us to publish this volume? Well, as scholars of German and Jewish studies, Gavriel and I just really wanted to do something and contribute to what's become, as you pointed out, Karen, a massive debate about whether or not the right-wing turn in contemporary US politics is indeed fascist. So we began to invite a growing array of established and new scholars, and we wanted to provide an in-depth historical perspective on the topic. We met first in November 2018 on my campus for a symposium. We met again at 2 or 3 German Studies Association conferences as a seminar and then as a panel series, both before and during the pandemic virtually, and then together again in person most recently this fall at the same conference. We also met at the American Historical Association's conference, I think it was January 2020, and I was struck by the Inside Higher Ed coverage of our panel. It was an invited panel by the AHA that brought several of us together. So the attention has been constant, and as you can tell, we focused a lot on growing a community of scholars among ourselves so that the publication was more than just a co-edited collection, that it had momentum. One of our big goals is to use our contributors' expertise to help make the stories and narratives they tell teachable to a broader public, especially at the K-12 level, obviously. And we, as we went, started to realize that we were engaging disparate fields, German and American history in particular, and different kinds of scholars within those geographical areas, because we wanted to see how everyone's respective expertise could shed light on the history and present day threat, because it obviously is now a very real threat of fascism in America. And through that hybridity, we started off as a European history publication for Cambridge, but morphed into an American history publication because those were the more compelling questions to ask. And as a result of that, we've become very much noticed by the American public with this book. It did reach US history bestseller status the moment it came out, and sustained that for quite a while, and is still doing very well. And that's pretty unusual for a German studies scholar, as you can tell, Karen, because obviously most people don't necessarily understand what a German studies or a Jewish studies scholar might have to bring to American history. But when we started to become more of a hybrid group, we realized we had some very interesting things to learn from each other and to communicate to the public.
I think you may be muted.
No, I was just asking you to continue.
Okay. Yeah. So, in terms of what I would add to the genesis of the book, and then maybe to say a couple words about the definition of fascism that appears, I think from a German studies perspective, it's always been a mantra among scholars in the field that the mistakes that led to the rise of the Nazis and to the crimes of the Second World War and the Holocaust should never be repeated. And for most of us who were grad students in the 90s or even earlier, and professionals, after the turn of the millennium, that mantra was always applied to Germany, which has sort of effectively been on probation in the eyes of the rest of the West for many decades now. But after 2015 and Trump's election as president in 2016, it became pretty clear that while Germany under Angela Merkel had become the most admired democracy in the West, the United States was backsliding. And so how German studies scholars could apply our own sort of best practices to the American context, a place that at least certainly most of the people in this volume where we actually live, that was an obvious transition point to make. I will say that in trying to figure out what fascism is in an American context, as opposed to what Nazism was in a German context, we get into all kinds of theoretical debates, all kinds of temptations to either use the term fascism expansively or to try and use it in a more restrictive fashion. I will say that the 14 contributors in our volume are not of the same opinion necessarily, which is a good thing. And I think we were definitely hoping that by collecting a variety of senior and junior scholars, people who have made very important contributions to scholarship like Jeff Ely or Linda Gordon or Tom Weber, and then younger scholars as well who are just breaking into the field, like Anna Dunsing or Alex Ross. We wanted to not speak as a unanimous chorus, so to speak, but to really raise, or at least present to our readers, this reality that it's an ongoing debate, what fascism is in one context, Europe, versus what it might be like in another context, the United States, how fascism might differentiate itself from Nazism, how in the American context, fascism could be distinguished from other right-wing phenomena like populism, like nativism, like what some people today in the context of Hungary or Poland refer to as a liberal democracy. Let's just say, without wanting to get into the weeds of political science definitions, we wanted to make it clear that fascism is a moving target of sorts, and that the case studies that appear in the volume are not identical in terms of how the term is used. But from my perspective, I think it's absolutely crucial to understand that fascism is in part a political movement, but it is also a sensibility that can have durability across time and space, and can manifest itself in multiple political forms, the most extreme version of which is, of course, fascism. But I think you put your finger on it earlier, Karen, when you said that this movement, as opposed to, say, populism or nativism, does embrace the method of violence to try and solve political disputes. It is targeted, at least from my perspective, primarily fascism is against the liberal democratic order. It certainly has anti-left-wing dimensions as well, anti-socialist dimensions. But because fascism usually springs up in a liberal democratic system, it first wants to destroy that enemy before taking on the other alternative to liberalism, which is some version of a Marxist socialist alternative. And in the fascist view of things, once liberal democracy is destroyed, the primary thing to replace it with is some form of dictatorship, in which one particular social group, usually defined in ethno-nationalist terms, will be given a place of hierarchical superiority over other groups that may exist pluralistically in that society. That all may sound very abstract, but there certainly is a long tradition in the United States of nativist feeling dating back to the mid-19th century. In some instances, those nativist movements have led to riots and episodes of small-scale killing. I think of the Philadelphia riots of 1844 that were directed against Irish Catholic immigrants. But by and large, the nativist phenomenon has not led to a sustained fascist movement or party in American history. The best case, unfortunately, for such a thing is probably what we're experiencing now within certain constituents of the MAGA movement, which I wouldn't tar across the board, or I wouldn't want to equate across the board with the Republican Party, which is still something of a, it's a shrinking tent, but it's still a big tent where you have some more moderate traditionalist figures alongside the more radical extremists. But unfortunately, they've taken up root in the Republican Party, and it's certainly in the interest of anyone who supports liberal democracy to make sure that that extremist wing doesn't become predominant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to go back to this issue of violence. I remember when Trump was elected in 2016, I had one of my students who happened to be Jewish came to my office and said, "My parents wanted me to ask you if we should leave." Right? So, what you talk about is that where did this heightened attention to these various movements that you mentioned, both historical and present day, for some people, it was the election of Trump. I would say, the essays in your volume that talk about Black anti-fascist movements, the awareness goes back into the 19th century. I mean, it's not a surprise for anyone who has studied the history of the Ku Klux Klan, Second Ku Klux Klan, etc. And then some people might say, well, now I believe you. I have people who say, okay, since January 6th, I now see what you mean, that maybe Trump is fascist or has fascist tendencies. So I guess to follow up on that, are we paying too much attention to Trump, the man? And is there not enough analysis of the although your volume does this, of course, the existing conditions, on the one hand, that we're already pretty far into this danger. And on the other hand, if one were to play devil's advocate, is the fragile, precarious, imperfect democracy in the US able to hold off a full-blown fascist nation, given the fact that at least at this point, we have elections fraught, of course, because of voter inequality. We have multiple, such as they are, political parties. We have the right to freedom of speech, also fraught, freedom of assembly. I mean, there are all these sort of freedoms, rights that seem to be on the edge as well. So is that enough to hold off, or do we really need to mobilize in a different way? And that's a question for both of you. Yeah.
Danny, you want to start us off?
Sure. Karen, you were referring to, in a way, what our opening chapter does by Jeff Ely. Obviously, Gav just mentioned the value of Jeff's work to start the ball rolling with not just the first section, but the volume as a whole, particularly because what he's doing is looking at portable definitions of fascism as a perennial set of options. So this is much, much more than a history book. And for us to understand why the perennial reattraction to all of this, we have to understand it from that perspective, as well as the historical context and differences over time in different countries and places. So what Jeff Ely manages to arrive at is, I think, a very valuable and simple way of understanding what fascism is and how we can learn to recognize it once it starts to depart from the norm, or from that teetering state of, as you're saying right now, how long can we hold on to our democracy? Notice your verb, which I want to get back to in a minute. But Jeff says, what differentiates fascists then and now is the desire, as Gav just indicated, to violently suppress and indeed kill or eliminate before they're even born enemies rather than argue with them. The preference also for an authoritarian state of a democracy, obviously, and the paramount exclusionary idea of a nation against a pluralism that values diversity and difference. So those three things, when they're in place, that is where Jeff wants us to understand that's the fascist platform. You were also talking about Trump versus beyond Trump. I think all of us understand now, right, that it's Trumpism. It doesn't need Trump to be just as dangerous to democracy. Getting back to what you were saying about resistance, Gav, do you want to come in at that point? And I'll pick up after that, because I'd like at some point to refer to how we can be, as intellectuals and teachers, engaged and resistant. But getting also back to your word, holding on, Karen, I'd like to linger on that for a little bit, because I'm not entirely convinced that the volume as a whole joins the movement of doomsayers. I don't think we do. I think what we're trying very much to do is to create pathways for engagement and the protection and defense of democratic institutions. And I want to get back to that in a minute, but over to you now, Gal.
Yeah, there's any number of points to pick up on here. I think with regard to the personal anecdote you mentioned with your student, Karen, should we leave? I would say that while Jewish historical memory is, a core part of anybody's Jewish identity, it would be a mistake to see an apples to apples comparison between the United States in 2023 and, say, Germany in 1933, for the obvious reason that there are many groups here in the United States, which has always been a diverse society, that fear and face a threat from MAGAism or Trumpism. Whereas, of course, in Nazi Germany, the 500,000 German Jews that lived there were the primary scapegoat. And while they might have had, potential alliances with the SPD, the socialists, or other groups on the left, that was a much more homogenous group of others, so to speak, for the Nazis to target. My point here, I suppose, is that Jews in America have a lot of allies that they have forged very solid relationships with as groups. whether it's African-American groups and the Urban League and NAACP for generations now, whether it's Asian American groups, whether it's LGBT groups. You know, the far right in America today has a whole range of scapegoats. And so Jews today are not alone. They're not by themselves. I know in this current war between Israel and Hamas, that's a whole other line of reasoning or a line of discussion that we could pursue. And of course, it is worrisome that there are some fissures developing on the left over the Middle East, potentially tearing apart the coalition that had come into being since 2015 to sort of halt Trumpism, and that was most vividly exhibited in the Charlottesville, protests that, of course, ended in tragedy. But there is a political question here, no question, about how to prioritize concerns, how to balance domestic policy considerations with foreign policy considerations, and above all, from a German history perspective, how to avoid the catastrophic collapse of the left in the late Weimar Republic between the communists and the socialists, who could never get past their own internal squabbles and ended up allowing the Nazis to take power.
Absolutely, Gav. Karen, can I just add to that a little bit?
Yeah, just before you do that, I wanted to remind everyone that you can go ahead and send in your questions at, using the Q&A function. So please feel free to do so as we're talking. Thank you. Go ahead, Janet.
You mentioned, Karen, the January 6th attack on the Capitol building of 2021. More recently, we've got Trump's November the 11th social media statement related to veterans' remembrance, and it directly warps the definition of fascism to the point that it's become the way the far right starts to understand the term. And I think that's what we're facing now as this country is sliding toward the next presidential election. It's the way in which the far right is having more success than the left at creating understanding of certain terms, certain historical events. According to the extreme right, the fascists are the far left, the protesters. Mm-hmm. Getting back also to the moment we're in right now, after the October 7th terror attacks on civilian Israelis by the militant group Hamas on October the 7th, as German and Jewish scholars of history and culture, obviously, Governor, and you also, Karen, we've been paying very close attention to the acts of anti-Semitic violence that are up, for example, in France and the US alone, up 300% since October the 7th. And in my home country of Britain, it's even worse. Acts of anti-Semitic violence since October the 7th are up a massive 537%. So in terms of how we are countering this country's apparent journey toward, ever closer toward the acceptance of some of the aspects of fascist behavior, fascist culture, fascist ways of living, it's all the more vital that we recognize where we are right now, as you indicated in our discussion, that this is a moment in time as a global crisis in the public's acceptance of racist violence, both in word and deed. And I'd like to refer to the UN human rights chief, the Austrian international human rights lawyer called Volker Türk, who said something quite handy. He's a scholar of international human rights law and refugee protection. I know that's very dear to your heart, Karen. So Volker Türk has overtly condemned this sharp rise in racial hatred globally. Obviously, with that, he means both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And as Gav just pointed out, it's absolutely right for us to do the very thing we do often as teachers in the classroom, and that's to remind our students what went wrong in the final years of the Weimar Republic. And one of the things that did go terribly wrong was that the left was not paying close enough attention to the right when it was paying too much attention to the bickering and disagreements amongst themselves. And that facilitated, therefore, the strength of the rise of Hitler and Hitlerism. They had the stronger narrative, they had the stronger story. Getting back to my point earlier about who's got the ability right now to rewrite the past or to put weight into terminology that the vast members of the of people seem to be able to accept quite openly. And therefore, we have a job as progressives, how do we continue to respond to in anti-discriminatory ways, and how do we emphasize the values of progressivism and the values of institutional protections of democracy? That's our job. Hopefully our volume does some good in helping create the discourse for that and the engagement and the rationale for it.
I wanted to raise another question, and that is about the means in which the ideologies or the calls for violence are being communicated. I mean, the difference between past fascist movements and politics is that now we have the World Wide Web, we have the internet, we have virtual realities. So we have people in isolation who aren't going out with groups or aren't even participating in mass rallies, but are sitting in their basements or sitting in their living rooms. And I would say this is across socioeconomic classes. I think that's another issue that hasn't really been raised here. So do you, and I'm not sure your volume, I mean, I think you do to some extent in your, Gavriel, in your discussion of popular culture and fascist imagination of the U.S. already being fascist in some of the series that you described. But what role do you see both working in propagating violent fascist acts based on fascist terminology, ideology through the web or through social media? At the same time, social media can be a place of resistance, right? So how do you see that tension, and how might we utilize and work against this kind of, building of a certain mob mentality that is, results in individuals committing acts of mass violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think the contrast is worth considering. Insofar as in the 30s and 40s, certainly in Europe and to some degree in America, the violence that existed was usually expressed in mass formations of people marching in the streets, lashing out violently against whoever they were targeting. I mean, Kristallnacht being one of the more notorious examples, but of course the SA in Germany had been, sending out bands of SA troops to beat up people and vandalize Jewish shops, of course. These days in America, and maybe it's a sign of or a function of American individualism, I see that there are tremendous efforts on the part of organized groups. They could be the Proud Boys, they could be the Oath Keepers, they could be, Nick Fuentes's crowd, trying to incentivize or otherwise incite lone wolf type people on the internet to engage in what social scientists are now calling stochastic violence. Basically egging on people who in some cases may be perfectly mentally sane. In other cases, I think it's clear there's some people who are mentally somewhat imbalanced, but they can be suggestible through internet peer pressure and wanting to be accepted by their group, their online virtual friends. And so perhaps what we're seeing here is more of groups trying to get individuals to carry out the violent fantasies of the people who are, egging them on. It's not groups of hundreds and hundreds of people pursuing specific targets. That, of course, was seen on January 6th, rather, 2021. But that was, still an event. That is still an event that is being taken apart by social scientists and historians to figure out what component of the crowd there was there for a specific coup. Who were the people who were looky-loos? Who were the hangers-on? Who were the opportunists? And while I don't think there's any doubt, given the fact that we've now had over 10 convictions on the charge of sedition of people like Stuart Rhodes and Enrique Tarrio and some of their followers who absolutely were pursuing episodes of mass violence, I think maybe the more worrisome thing, at least in the short term, is to see the continuation of lone gunmen who are carrying out a tradition that we've seen all too often in school shootings, in mass massacres directed against African American churches or predominantly Black shopping centers in cities like Buffalo. All of those instances of violence are sort of the solitary shooters, if you will. but those people are not acting in a vacuum. They're acting in a context of specific groups promoting through social media anti-Semitic, racist, white supremacist visions of the past and future.
Janet, do you want to add anything?
Well, I think I can pick up on some of those strands later, but over to you, Karen.
Yeah, well, I wanted to begin to bring in some of the audience questions. So before I do that, is there anything either of you wanted to mention about the volume that hasn't yet been addressed that you want to make sure we cover?
Well, perhaps I could just make a quick mention about some of the inspirational items for many people in the Zoom room and beyond, because many of us are engaging in similar sorts of things that this book tries to achieve. I've mentioned Tim Snyder's handbook on tyranny. It's a handbook in a way of recommendations of what we all need to do to understand and help prevent tyranny. And of course, his book's been made so much better by the graphic novel version. I'm a big fan of Nora Krogan. I just wanted to mention the accessibility and the way in which we get the word out is a key issue of how we can be effective. And obviously a graphic novel is a massively effective strategy in that. So in Tim Snyder's book on tyranny, my favorite section is his second lesson: protect democratic institutions, protect institutions. And that seems perhaps almost a grand thing to say, but what he actually reminds us of is so useful. All of us can do something along those lines, no matter who we are. And one of the most powerful things we can do, for example, is help public libraries and push back against the ideologically motivated banning of books. So as Tim Snyder says, defending institutions doesn't just mean defending them blindly. It means asking questions and defending the values that those institutions are meant to represent and be informed by, and not just following along with whatever happens or what the institution tells us. So if the law changes and you're a lawyer, what are you actually doing in your everyday life that asks the question, is this in fact a change in the law that is pro-democracy, for example? So perhaps we can just use the analogy of the sort of house of democracy. We must protect the house of democracy as best we can, wherever we're situated in that house. It could be a door, it could be a window, it could be the roof or the walls. We've all got a role to play, no matter how potentially small it may feel, but it's about the active engagement. That's the key. That's the response. That's the engagement that I think is crucial. And as educators, it's obviously the classroom as one of them, and helping people in other classroom contexts to engage as well. Over to you, Gav.
Yeah, for 10 final seconds, all I was going to say is Jenna makes an excellent point. We need to vote to preserve institutions. We don't just vote because we love a particular candidate. You know, all the debate about Joe Biden, is he too old? Is he too, mentally not what he used to be and so forth? It is all beside the point, because we're not voting in any given election only for a personality. We're voting for a party that's going to defend liberal democratic institutions versus one party that seems to feel not that committed to them. And so we need to look past the candidates and the personalities and realize that the parties have different perspectives towards, say, preserving the legal system, the Department of Justice, not to mention any number of other agencies that oversee civil rights and free speech.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to bring in some of the questions that have been raised. And some of these refer back to some of the earlier statements. So we're switching back and forth here. So Anastasia asks, while I understand and see some validity in your point, I think she's referring to the protection of Jews in the US. She says, the groups targeted by the Nazi Germans were potentially less varied than the swath of groups targeted by the US far right. I question calling German Jews homogeneous, since they really came from all walks of life. I'm not sure what I'm asking here, but I just want us to be careful that we don't collapse the complexity of human experience? And then another similar question by Sylvia Stern is, should we be making a qualitative difference between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? So we'll start there.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a fair point to note that the last thing I would at least want to come out of my observation about the differences between the U.S. and Germany is any sense of our feeling entitled to feel complacent about the present day situation facing Jews and others in the U.S. All I mean to say is that we should take hope and be optimistic about the fact that we are not alone in the United States. We have had allies for many, many decades now, and to nurture those relationships and to stand up, as we, for example, have at the Center for Jewish History. Just to give you one example, we've done a lot of events recently with the Museum of Chinese in America for obvious reasons. Chinese Americans, Asian Americans in New York City have been victimized by a lot of street crime in recent years. Obviously, COVID and the notion that COVID came from China has led them to feel increasingly vulnerable. Jews feel vulnerable for all kinds of reasons that may not exactly be related, but we do share an interest in standing up to right-wing people who would want to otherwise, who would want to slur or defame or otherwise work to harm our interests. And then when you consider the many other groups that are being targeted, say, by the Christian right on any number of issues, I feel like coalition building and coalition politics is certainly the order of the day, because divided we fall, united we have a better chance of standing opposed to the things that hurt anyone who believes in liberal democratic values.
Okay, thank you. Janet, do you want to add anything?
Well, those are very important reflections and questions. So thank you for those. But I just maybe can add on some aspects related to where some of the contributors are going in their chapters in Fascism in America, our volume. And what I find valuable is they, together, despite their varied views, they do achieve something cohesive. And what they do is that they point out that indigenous fascist tendencies are in fact part of the American democracy story. We're not trying to defend democratic institutions today against the rise of fascist tendencies in contemporary politics without having had, without being we're sort of the legacy of American fascist leanings that have not been at all recognized by the general public as indigenous, as native to this country's democracy. And one reason is, of course, we fought the good war as allies in the middle of the 20th century, and that good war narrative became dominant. So for us to understand the exact opposite about the Allies' identity in particular at that time is a hard thing to teach. And that's kind of what this book is trying to lean toward. Let me draw on the chapter by Linda Gordon, who, as a scholar of the Klan, draws attention to the second KKK's perhaps most lasting achievement, and that is the normalization of racial bigotry against all non-whites, including Jews and Catholics in this country. And her point in the chapter is to say the second Klan helped forge the US electorate's widespread support for the 1924 Immigration Act, which by the 1930s would subsequently prevent Anne Frank's family and others from various countries, but also obviously at that time Germany, from reaching the United States in time. They were prevented from doing so, and it's thanks to these indigenous fascist tendencies, you could say, of the Klan that were not necessarily thinking about or designed to prevent European Jews from reaching these shores. They had other priorities at that time, but that was certainly the effect. So Gordon's chapter underscores how it's about the belief systems that justify racial oppression, terror, and exclusion against a variety of groups. And therefore, that is the commonality between contemporary anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, regardless of the differences between the groups. Because at that time, it was a reign of terror under Jim Crow for African Americans, And it became entrenched to the point that, as James Whitman, a Yale legal historian, has pointed out in his book, Hitler's American Model, it was an inspiration for Hitler's lawyers to come over to the United States and take that knowledge back and create, of course, the Nuremberg race laws in the mid-1930s. So these kinds of correlations run deep in American identity, and that is part and parcel of the historical content of our contributors chapters. And we're very proud of them, in a way, putting that narrative together that is still relatively understood, and perhaps willfully so, because it can cause disturbance and distraction from what people want to believe about the country.
So a few follow-up questions that are related to what you just said. So Alan Birkenwald asks, I think you've answered this question already, but it might be important to refer back to it. He's asking you, I think mostly you, Gavriel, do you no longer have faith or trust in our established checks and balances? I mean, both of you are saying that this is extremely important to uphold certain institutions so that these checks and balances remain in place. But is there, maybe not just among you two, but some of the contributors or others, that our faith or trust in it is waning, and rather than going out to uphold it, there's a way of sort of retreating, right? In a sense of, in some cases, giving up. And related to that, another, Olivia Aquilar asks, how does the lack of trust in news, journalism play a role in the current trend? So misinformation, right? How do we know we're even getting what everyone understands under authentic reporting, that we have access to the information? Education, you mentioned earlier too, Janet, the importance of being able to discern different forms of news, what's true, what's not true, what's agitatory, what's a call for resistance. So this is sort of an iteration on some of what you're talking about already, but welcome you if you were.
So why don't I tackle the first one, and Jan, if you want to talk about news and trustworthiness, if that's all right. I was just going to say that the legal system is the one system that, to this point in time at least, has retained its ability to adjudicate attempts to fudge the truth, with former President Trump having 91 counts of indictment against him in multiple legal venues, whether it's in Georgia or in the state of New York or what have you, with Jack Smith going forward. My hope is that the more transparent those legal cases unfold and are brought to a conclusion, the more transparently that takes place, the more that people will be prevented from trying to create counter narratives that are based on pure fiction, because at the end of the day, the legal system is the referee. And if we use the sports analogy, whereby since 2015, Democrats and Republicans, pro and anti-Trumpers, have been lobbing accusations against each other, and it's been something of a contest, at the end of the day, there is still going to be a referee that we call the judicial system that's going to declare one the winner and one the loser. And of course, it's certainly possible people can deny the validity of the results. But if it's done in a prolonged fashion, as it seems that it will be in the months starting after, once 2024 arrives, then at least we'll have some ability to know that this aspect of our checks and balances system, this component of it, which it has up until this point too as well, I would argue, it's held firm. That will be something that may well save us. Obviously, the two political parties don't see eye to eye on whether the judicial branch of government is being objective or not, but it's safe to say, the Supreme Court has certainly not been a liberal partisan institution in recent years. And if the Justice Department is different, and if both sides of the political aisle get some wins out of the system, maybe that's the best way for them to believe that at least it is as impartial as it can be. I'm hardly saying that's a satisfying answer, but the referees in the end may be what you know, who they may be the people who can preserve some degree of faith among people in our system.
Okay.
Janet, what do you think about the news, the trustworthiness issue?
Well, evil words tend to foment evil deeds, and social media's power makes that all the more possible. And those of you who've looked at AI pilots can see that AI itself is faulty because it tends to re-echo the echo chamber and augment it even more. So we're in for a ride with more of this as AI starts to take a bigger role in what people are doing on social media. But getting back to the fact that fascist movements have always understood the relationship between dehumanizing language and dehumanization of people and violence toward them, there's a lot still that we can do and must do, and absolutely not consider anything a foregone. I mean, I personally am not of the opinion that we're going to face the worst case scenario with the next presidential election, because I do think that activism and recognition of truth, historical truth, and political progressivism will in fact get stronger. So we do need materials. We do need to give K-12 teachers the ability, more materials to teach historical events in such a way that they don't get fired for doing so if they're in red states. So primary source materials are perhaps the way to do that, or through the lens of a first-person experience, such as a child, in order to gain perspective and empathy that depoliticizes and opens up a topic to people who might otherwise think that that's a no-go zone for the classroom. So if we're truly to protect what we're trying to cherish most, there are things that we as educators can immediately do in strengthening our engagement with our public school system. Social media's power takes up on some of these myths and beliefs that we mentioned earlier. It's no coincidence that we're facing a time now, or are in one now, where the narratives of racial purification and national and racial regeneration, aka the white great replacement theory, considered by white supremacists to be the all-out conspiracy that the left is driven by, that kind of narrative is pushed and fermented in our current social media climate. So we do have to have better ways to create narratives of engaging, so that that's not too widespread. Perhaps that's another reason why this volume has been read so much, because what we're trying to do is help provide those kinds of material. I'd also like to refer briefly, if I can, to two chapters focus by Anna Dunsing and Usman Power Green, because they focus on Black anti-fascism and the efforts of Black anti-fascist intellectuals and activists who've been looking at this for a very long time, because from the Black experience under Jim Crow and for decades after World War II, the ways in which they experience reality in this American democracy certainly was not something that whites would have understood. And so African-American anti-fascist activism is a key lens, a key way in which you can open up a new window in people's understanding about what this country was actually doing in the middle of the 20th century to see how racist federal and state policies that seem innocuous actually represented a great threat, not just to the people most affected by it, in this case, African Americans, but to American democracy more broadly. And that's the true value of the contribution of Usman Power Green and Anna Dunsing and others who've mentioned it in our volume. In other words, once we understand that democratic values themselves are endangered by deeds against minorities in this country, then we better understand how to deal with it. Now, the election of Donald Trump, of course, ushered in a brand new era when all of a sudden that which had been hiding in the shadows was brought out into the daylight. And that is a major shift. That happened in August 2017 in Charlottesville, for example, and it happened and it keeps happening ever since. So I think we can turn to Black activism and the long intellectual and political tradition that they offer as a way to say that Trump's ascendancy certainly signals a distressing slide toward fascism in American society, but there are paths of resistance that have existed before and ones that we can turn to create new avenues of discussion with audiences who need it the most. And obviously you can tell I keep referring to K-12, but obviously also I'm referring to our university populations. And the people who engage these issues through the use of public libraries, I think, is another key audience. So public events at public libraries.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I also would add sort of radical feminist anti-fascist movements also in the 1930s and during the interwar period. I mean, that's people like Darcy Berkla and others are starting to work on, that particular group that I think also hasn't been getting enough attention in these discussions. So we have time for maybe two more questions. There are two related questions. They're mostly related to the Weimar Republic. So Alexander Mihalovich asks, there's much to be said about the fascist adjacent values of evangelical Protestant groups in the United States. At the same time, those groups engage in a spuriously philo-Semitic or putatively pro-Israel project of speaking against leftist anti-Semitism and in supporting Israel as a democratic state. How do these efforts, which have no counterpart in late Weimar era Germany, complicate our discussion of present-day American fascism? And then a somewhat related question, Andrew Palela, we discussed the way in which the Weimar Republic's liberal wing spent too much time and energy fighting itself rather than fighting the rise of Nazi fascism. And that was linked to questions about the current Democratic Party's inability to defeat the rise of Trump and MAGA conservatism. However, I wonder if there is also a question to be asked about the American left's inability to address the material conditions of Americans since the 1970s. Should the contemporary left worry about combating the rise of MAGA conservatism, or should it attempt to undermine MAGA conservatism by addressing the material needs of people with traditional left policies? I mean, that's a broader question. I'm not sure.
No, those are both great questions. Well, let me just take a stab at the first one. The historical parallels with Weimar are well known. I think the obvious difference is in the 30s, there wasn't yet a state of Israel to complicate matters even further. It's clearly the case that at least since the Netanyahu government and the Likud have been increasingly aggressive, that right-wing groups that are already tending towards authoritarianism are feeling even more comfortable supporting the Netanyahu government. There's always been evangelical Christian Zionist support for the state of Israel for theological reasons. And it's very hard to square that, of course, with their perspective on American Jews who by and large tend to be secular and tend to be liberal and are still voting 75–80% for Democratic candidates who favor things like LGBTQ rights, like gay marriage, like you just go on down the list, secular education and so forth. What it illustrates is that there is a growing discourse today on the right about good Jews and bad Jews. Unlike the Nazis who believed all Jews were bad, whether they were left-wing, socialist, Marxist, or right-wing capitalist Jews, there is this division of labor now whereby liberal democratic Jews are bad, but say the 20% of the American Jewish electorate that votes for the GOP and might be tending towards supporting Trump for various reasons having to do with Israel, they're okay. That is a worrisome phenomenon in and of itself, but it just sort of speaks to the fact that at a certain point, the Weimar analogy only gets us so far. I do think that there's a long, long history in America of the far right being predominantly a Protestant phenomenon rooted in nativism. Father Coughlin in the 1930s and the Christian Front, of course, made it clear that Catholic anti-Semitism and Catholic fascism, or what some people call clerical fascism, also is possible. But in the United States case, it typically has been a Protestant phenomenon dating back to the desire of the original white European settlers in this country to pull up the ladder and prevent others who might be Christian, but weren't Protestant from getting a leg up as well. And so, yes, the overlaps between the Christian right, which doesn't have to be fascist, and the far right secular fascists who might see Christianity as a means for them to gain supporters for their more violent agenda, that is something I think we have to keep our eyes on.
Mm-hmm. Janet, any thoughts, or should I go to the next question?
Well, the last question that was asking about whether or not the left can respond appropriately with emphasis on progressive policies, emphasis on healthcare, I think is a very good point. And I'd like to refer back to my emphasis today on belief systems and ideology, because fascism is a belief system where the label itself is denied. So if you're an anti-Semite, usually the last thing you would see yourself as is an anti-Semite. If you are behaving or proving or behaving in such a way, or with your vote behaving in such a way that you could be labeled a fascist, you would not see yourself that way. So I refer also to Jason Stanley, the philosopher, who says, for fascist parties and politicians to win elections, they must usually attract support from people who, if asked, would loudly reject the fascist label. So what are they voting for or against if it's not overtly understood that the consequences of what those votes indicate is in fact leading to fascism or is fascistic? It's masked, heavily masked by, as the questioners have been indicating, by themes of resentment, by themes of the lost or wasted life. And that is what ultimately we must pay very close attention to, because Hitler knew very well how to tap into that. At what point does someone start to land their grievances at the door of fascism? So again, it's the level of ideology that we have to pay attention to. It's the common denominator between American and European, and especially German variants of fascism. And yet that ideology is not always present in our society with a great big fascism label. If we take American eugenics, for example, Madison Grant in 1916, as Jason Stanley has said, passed the book called The Passing of the Great Race, the supposed replacement of whites in America by Black people and all the immigrants, including what was considered to be a non-white at that time, namely Polish Jews. According to the eugenicist then, Madison Grant, these groups posed an existential threat to the Nordic race, America's quote-unquote native class. This eugenicist ways of thinking is starting to be obviously regurgitated among white supremacists with the Great Replacement theory, conspiracy theory, as we pointed out already. So be very careful when, of course, resentments start to get so strong that they become the leading narrative of somebody's life, and what they're substituting as a result, a more engaged, honest conversation with how to improve people's lives, so that themes of resentment about the lost life don't take over in as more attractive as a way to vote than the ability to find answers through real progressive policies. Over to you, Gav, about responding to that, or back to you, Karen.
Okay, it looks like, okay, so we have about 5 minutes or so. And we have one more question. Jonathan Skolnick asks, there's a lot of discussion in Europe about imported anti-Semitism. In terms of fascism in the US, does your book shed light on the immigrant, minority, native dynamic in relation to fascism and anti-Semitism? in the Italian-American, German-American, and Irish-American milieus, the Hitler fascination and anti-Semitism in some parts of the African-American community that Richard Wright wrote about.
Well, greetings to my friend Jonathan. Hello, Jonathan. It's always good to hear from you. If the question is really about the extent to which some of these trends are imported and some of them are domestic or like indigenous and hatched from within American life, I think the jury's kind of still out. For example, the silver shirts are clearly a movement led by William Pelly that had roots in Protestant thought, as Leo Rebuffo had pointed out already in his famous book from 2 generations ago. But despite the fact that there are American origins to the silver shirts, he decided to create his movement to mark Hitler's rise to power. Not to mention the fact that the Christian Front was also inspired by the right-wing movement against the Popular Front in the Spanish Civil War. So American fascists in the 30s certainly took inspiration from things going on in Europe. Whether they should be seen by contrast, however, as a direct import, say with the German-American Bund, which was largely comprised of German Americans or recent German immigrants, and has always been seen as a sign that this was a foreign phenomenon, not really rooted in American traditions. There is an interplay between, and a transatlantic dialogue between the United States in the 30s and 40s and Europe at that same time. I think there's no question that the same thing's happening today when Donald Trump praises Viktor Orban, or when European right-wingers exchange views about the Great Replacement theory, which was originally a French construct, and then it ends up being embraced by white nationalists here. There is a back and forth that I think we're only starting to really realize has existed for some time. Michelle Kahn has done some great work on this subject recently, talking about neo-Nazis in the 70s and 80s and how they influence each other across the pond, as it were. So this is a very important topic. I'm grateful, Jonathan, for you bringing it up, and much work is still to be done.
Any thoughts, Janet, on
Well,
this?
as a practical note, we do want to mention Cynthia Miller-Idris's concluding chapter, her center that studies polarization in societies globally at American University, has go-to materials for anyone who's witnessing polarization among specifically youth, but not necessarily that. And she speaks regularly on the Hill and also to the German government about ways in which polarization can be addressed and dealt with and opened up for discussion and re-education in some instances. So there are practical things in which ways in which contributors like Cynthia Miller-Idris achieve steps toward improving the current situation on an everyday basis. So, for example, if a parent or a teacher witnesses an obvious case of polarized right-wing youth, then there are materials that can be sent to that parent or to that teacher to help deal with the situation from Cynthia's center. So these are the kinds of things that I think we need to be paying very close attention to as scholar activists in all our areas. What can we do that is going beyond what we have been trained to do? And how can we literally be part of engaging the public in narratives that are not completely and utterly controlled by the right, and that we can bring the center back to the center, because obviously the center is shifting over to the right as we speak.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up. There is one more question, which is in some ways I think has already been answered, and that's from Jill Solomon Marland, who wanted some commentary on legislative fascism and judicial fascism in the US. And I think in some ways you've already answered that question.
Well, we do have states that are engaging in that sort of behavior, my own, others, Texas particularly with the anti-transgender and anti-LGBTQ laws, that are very prevalent in various states, but those two states in particular. We do have, therefore, several calls for alarm that people in, say, disability rights certainly have been noticing and drawing close attention to. And you have to look for these things in places that aren't explicit at times. In medical gene editing technology, if that's going to be introduced, and it will be, what does it truly mean for the disabled community, and what can be done to assist the disabled community when apparently 24 or 23% of the human population carries some kind of genetic condition that gene editing may wish to eradicate? And so we have, of course, an immediate step toward the devalorizing of certain kinds of life. For the disabled population, that's a fascist / eugenicist alarm bell. So I do think we have a lot to do in order to bridge better to the communities who are already being very severely impacted in our country right now by certain kinds of legislation or certain kinds of medical technologies that are taking off without people really being able to properly respond to their consequences in society.
Okay, I wanted to thank both of you. I know that my particular reading of your volume has already shifted somewhat in having this conversation, which I hope that your book becomes a standard textbook. I mean, I think that would be really useful, as you pointed out, and also each essay on its own stands and could be the focus of particular issues that you've all raised. I just wanted to give you both the last word, and I wanted to do so by just quoting Dorothy Thompson, the journalist Dorothy Thompson, who Linda Gordon quotes in her essay. And Dorothy Thompson in 1935 said, "When our dictator turns up, you can depend on it that he will be one of the boys and he will stand for everything traditionally American." And that struck me. So I'm just wondering, are we there yet? Are we not there yet?
All I would say is, thinking about the importance of leadership, political leadership, there's no question in my mind that American history in the 1930s and 40s could have gone really, really much worse had FDR not been our president. As we probably all know, he was almost assassinated in Miami in early 1933 before his inauguration. And if another president is in office from 1933 to 44 or 45, there's no question that some of the right-wing trends that he blunted, domestic right-wing trends, not to mention fighting against Nazi Germany in World War II, those things never would have happened, and our democracy would have faced a very, very, very severe test. So the importance of backstops, leaders who will defend liberal democratic institutions when millions of people have lost faith in them or have been conditioned to think that they no longer serve them. That is something we should very much be mindful of when we're all considering our votes in the 2024 election, I think.
Okay. Janet, last word.
Well, first of all, thank you, Karen, for everything that we've talked about today, and thank you to the audience for these great questions and discussion points.
Yes, thank you.
We must, I think, keep our resolve as scholars of history and culture to make sure that we can teach historical events and truths in such a way that we do so without fear, and that others around us can also talk about without fear. That's our obligation. And let's not have the extreme right continue to damage the memory of the Holocaust. As someone who teaches comparative genocide studies, I'm obviously a practitioner of making sure that multiple contexts of genocide are understood. But I think we all have to understand that a pivotal event or two certainly did occur in the middle of the 20th century. And we must understand our obligation that the 70-odd extremist groups that the Southern Poverty Law Center says are currently on the books and active, most of them are extreme far right, that they include Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism as a major plank of their racist platform, no matter what their platform seems to be otherwise. In other words, we're still responding to that issue of the Holocaust in the middle of the 20th century, even if we are, as a society, now, I think, much more increasingly taking our inspiration from Black Lives Matter and the history of slavery and the legacy of domestic right-wing cruelty and Jim Crow apartheid for so many of our Americans. So we have an American indigenous narrative that we need to advocate as essentially something that's linked to not just the history of fascism, but where we are right now as a society. And at the same time, we have to increasingly understand that the yardsticks we've taken for granted in teaching issues like World War II and the Holocaust, they're on the move because the extreme right has started to move them very effectively. We have a very big job to do to make sure that historical truth and freedom to be able to talk about difficult issues is maintained as a yardstick of American democracy moving forward.
Okay. So I wanted to thank both of you once again for joining us in the middle of the day. And I just wanted to commend you on this work and also the collaborators, the contributors who worked on this with you. And thank you so much for your inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you for hosting, Karen.
You're welcome.